All right. Hey ho, let's go. This is Resistance Radio, where natural selection selects resistance and where public health means protecting people, not selecting who gets protected. Today, we are talking about the administration's new executive order on childhood vaccines, and I'm going to ask an uncomfortable question. Is this simply bad vaccine policy, or are we looking at an example of soft eugenics operating through public policy? Now, that's a serious claim, and I'm not going to ask you to accept it because I said it. We're going to define what soft eugenics means, and then I'm going to introduce 4 questions that I think every public health policy should have to survive. And right now, I'm calling this Dr. Derry's public health principles. And we're going to run this executive order through those principles. And more importantly, we're going to answer the questions. And then when we're finished, we'll see whether this policy is consistent with the soft eugenics framework. So first off, what is soft eugenics? When we hear the word eugenics, we understandably think about some of the darkest chapters of modern history. We think about forced sterilization, racial pseudoscience, government deciding who was fit and who was unfit, and ultimately genocide. That's what we might call hard eugenics, the state actively using coercion to determine which people should reproduce and which people should not, and whose life society ultimately values. But last year, writer Derek Barris made an argument in The Guardian about something he called soft eugenics. He was talking specifically about the US. And what he defined this as is a mechanism being different. Government doesn't necessarily have to explicitly declare somebody unworthy of protection. Instead, you dismantle the systems that protect vulnerable people. You withdraw services. You reduce collective protections. You replace public responsibility with the language of individual responsibility, and then you allow the consequences to fall where everyone already knows they're going to fall, on the vulnerable. That's the idea I want you to get into your head today. Because if government knowingly withdraws protection and the predictable result is that the strongest and the wealthiest can protect themselves while the vulnerable disproportionately bear the consequences, and then I think we have an obligation to ask, how different is this outcome? Okay, so now let's test this proposition. Let's talk about Dr. Derry's public health principles. I'm going to introduce something that I'm going to use again and again on Resistance Radio, and these are these 4 principles, right? These 4 questions: protection, foreseeability, burden, and evidence. And we're not going to just discuss them theoretically. We're going to run this executive order through them right now. So principle number 1, does the policy increase protection or reduce it? So what's our answer? Well, obviously, it reduces it. And here's why. The administration wants to reduce the number of vaccines routinely recommended on the federal childhood schedule. It also wants measles, mumps, and rubella vaccination separated into individual shots rather than the combined MMR vaccine. Except there's an astonishing problem. Those 3 individual vaccines aren't currently even licensed in the United States. The combined MMR vaccine has been used for decades. So we're talking an available intervention with decades of safety and effectiveness data, and proposing to replace it with separate products that aren't even currently available in the US. And separating and spacing vaccines actually now creates another problem: more injections, potentially more visits, more opportunities for appointments to be missed, and most importantly, more time during which a child remains susceptible to disease. So principle 1 asks, does this increase protection? The answer is no. Based on what we currently know, it creates opportunities for protection to be delayed or missed without demonstrating compensating health benefits. So principle 1 fails. Principle number 2, are the harms foreseeable? So what's the answer? Yes, of course. And this is important. We don't have to guess what happens when vaccinations are delayed. The American Academy of Pediatrics explicitly says that there's no medical reason to delay or space out recommended vaccines, and that doing so increases the amount of time a child remains at risk for vaccine preventable diseases. Alternative schedules haven't been demonstrated to provide superior safety or effectiveness. And vaccine schedules aren't arbitrary calendars. They're designed around when children are susceptible to particular diseases and when vaccinations can protect them. So if you deliberately increase the interval before protection, increased susceptibility isn't some bizarre unintended consequence nobody could have imagined. It's actually foreseeable. And policymakers are being told that now before these changes are fully implemented. Therefore, if vaccination declines or children remain susceptible longer, nobody gets to say, who possibly could have known? We knew. Principle 2, are the harms foreseeable? Yes, they 100% are. Principle number 3, who bears the burden? Well, this answer is also pretty clear. The burden will not be distributed equally. Imagine vaccinations now require additional visits. Who's best positioned to manage that? Well, a family, let's say, with excellent insurance, maybe 2 parents with flexible jobs, reliable transportation, a pediatrician who's just 10 minutes away. Now change that family. A parent who's now paid hourly, no paid leave, 1 car, 45 minutes from the nearest pediatrician. Maybe they're already struggling to get their child to every appointment. The biological consequences aren't distributed either equally. An infant who's too young to be fully vaccinated doesn't get to exercise, quote unquote, personal choice. Neither does somebody who cannot receive a vaccine because of a medical contraindication. They depend partly on everyone around them being protected. So who bears the greatest burden when collective protection declines? People with the least ability to protect themselves from the consequences. That's precisely why public health exists. So principle number 3, who bears the burden? Disproportionately, the vulnerable do. And now principle 4, what evidence justifies accepting that burden? This should be where the administration argument becomes the strongest. If you're going to accept all those costs, presumably you've discovered an important health benefit. So where is the evidence? For separating MMR into 3 individual vaccines, manufacturers and major medical organizations say there is no scientific evidence demonstrating a benefit. Decades of evidence support the safety and effectiveness of continued MMR vaccination. The administration says its approach will provide better or gold standard protection. Fine, but that's really a hypothesis. Where are the data demonstrating that separating these vaccines produces superior outcomes? Where are the studies showing that additional visits improve safety? Where is the evidence showing that children are healthier when vaccination is delayed? That's the extraordinary thing. We're not looking at compelling new evidence overturning old scientific consensus. Medical organizations are saying that evidence supporting the existing approach hasn't disappeared. So principle number 4, is there compelling scientific evidence demonstrating that these additional burdens produce a superior public health outcome based on the current available evidence? The answer is no. And that's not a small problem. It's actually the central problem. So let's put all those 4 answers together. Here's what Derry's public health principles have told us. Protection. Will this policy increase protection? No. It risks delaying or reducing protection. Foreseeability. Can we anticipate the potential harms? Yes. Experts are telling us that those risks, experts are telling us what those risks are before implementation. Burden. Will those harms fall equally across society? No. They will disproportionately affect people with fewer resources and people who depend most heavily upon collective protection and evidence. Is there compelling scientific evidence demonstrating that accepting those additional risks produce better health outcomes? No. No evidence establishing that benefit has been presented. So now we go back to where we started. Is this soft eugenics? Remember our definition? A system doesn't necessarily have to explicitly say these people aren't worth protecting. Instead, it can withdraw collective protection. Know that the consequences will disproportionately affect vulnerable people. Accept those consequences and justify the withdrawal through the language of personal responsibility or individual choice. Now compare that with what our 4 questions revealed. Protection decreases, the potential harms are foreseeable, those harms disproportionately burden vulnerable people, and compelling evidence demonstrating a superior public health benefit has not been produced. The pattern is consistent with soft eugenics framework that we've been discussing, and this is why I'm willing to use the term. Not because I've read somebody's mind, not because I had a secret memo saying let vulnerable people get sick. I don't need one to identify what a policy does. Public policy has consequences, and once those consequences are foreseeable, once you've been warned about them, once you deliberately proceed anyway, those consequences become part of a moral evaluation of the policy. That's the public health piece that public health as a profession has been too polite to talk about. We keep debating intentions. I want us to start evaluating outcomes. Who gets protected? Who doesn't? Who knew? Where is the evidence? But because behind every public health failure is a public policy story. And when public policy knowingly removes protection from a population without evidence of a compensating health benefit and predictably transfers the resulting risk toward people least able to protect themselves, I believe that we should be willing to say what that pattern actually represents. So this is Resistance Radio, where natural selection selects resistance. And when policy starts selecting who gets protected, resistance becomes a public health intervention. Thank you for tuning in.